Okay, so this is my first talking head video from my new place. I've moved. So new background. Um, this one is about doing lived experience involvement work as a patient public involvement or engagement or PPIE reviewer. Um, Something that people with lived experience of mental health might be looking to get into. I'm making this video because it's actually surprisingly hard to find PPIE work. I'm involved in a few projects, but most of those came about as an offshoot of my research, not as. So it was very strange. So, I was doing my PhD, someone read some of my research, invited me to a conference. I thought I was there to talk about my research, and then before I went up on stage they said if you could just talk about your experience of psychosis, and I was like, oh, okay, is that why I'm here? So that led to a couple of jobs doing some work with the Dialogue Initiative and the Brain's Vital Study. So these are two studies that are looking at language in psychosis. So they're related to my research, but my job is to be a lived experience advisor. So it's a very weird place for me to be because I know what they're talking about academically, but it's not my job to actually say anything academic in those contexts, right? So it's kind of like having both arms tied behind your back sort of thing, or having to sit on your hands. But those are interesting pieces of work. Most of the questions that I'm asked are things like, do you think people with schizophrenia would be able to handle these experimental materials? Do you foresee any problems with comprehension? That sort of thing. I'm also a reviewer for the NIHR. And that's more of an academic role. In fact, actually, I think when I signed up, I ticked the lived experience box and the academic sort of expertise box. So I think I'm a dual perspective reviewer. So when they send me a project, some projects they might be looking for lived experience involvement, and for some they might be looking for sort of someone with a PhD to talk about the methodology or something. Every time I get a project through the NIHR, I do both. I say, as someone with lived experience, this is what it looks like, and as somebody who does research, these are the things that I find interesting about your methods. For example, the idea that you expect a 30% attrition rate in a study that's focused exclusively on motivation and involves an experimental battery. Your attrition rate is going to be much higher because most people without motivation issues and without schizophrenia get fucking bored and tired of experimental batteries. So what do you think is going to happen to people with motivation difficulties? It's going to be much higher than 30%, I'm also on the Lived Experience Advisory Panel for Bipolar UK and the Brain and Genomics Hub, working with Professor Tanya Gergel, and I hope I've said her name right. And we're doing some really interesting stuff there. We've just put a preprint out that is like 80% Tanya's hard work. But, I made some comments on it. And that's about sort of formalizing a framework for involving people with lived experience in research. Hopefully that sort of does some good. And I'm also involved in the CONQUER study, which is a cognitive task for people with psychosis, and I'm a lived experience advisor for that. So how did I get into all of this? Well, most of it was through doing a PhD. And then people going, oh, and you also have experience of the condition. Oh, well, I know about some opportunities. So if you Google lived experience involvement opportunities, you won't find very much. I am also doing some stuff with Rethink at the moment. That's a relatively new project, and that came about because I wrote a blog for them, which is coming out in a couple of months or something. And when you write a blog for Rethink, there's an option to say, I would also like to be contacted about other opportunities to be an expert by experience. So if you're interested, if you've watched the video up until this point and you're like, tell me how you got into it, what can I do? The things that you can sort of search for are writing a blog post for Rethink about your experience, which then opens the door to signing up for other opportunities with Rethink. If you have academic experience of research and a mental health diagnosis or experience of mental health, you can look into the Brain and Genomics Hub and Bipolar UK and the Lived Experience Advisory Panel. They have lots of opportunities for lived experience involvement. You can also get involved with the NIHR. So you can Google NIHR reviewer opportunities, lived experience reviewer opportunities. And but in terms of like a formalized hub or a formalized sort of pathway into this kind of work, there isn't one that I can really find. There are companies that offer lived experience consultancy. There are like consultancy firms that place lived experience advisors with companies that are seeking that kind of input. Now, I've reached out to them and they've said, oh, it's fine, we've got enough people. So I don't know how successful you would be trying to get set up with one of them, but that's also another option. In terms of opportunities through like NHS jobs, I'm not keeping up with what's going on in NHS lived experience work at the moment. I have seen on the grapevine on social media that they are creating new roles like Director of Lived Experience, and that's like a Band 7 role or a Band 8 role, which is obviously very nice. But that is, something that I wouldn't necessarily be able to tolerate, because it would involve taking on quite a significant amount of responsibility and working full-time hours probably within an organisation, which for me can absolutely fuck off. Like, workplace politics and workplace dynamics are the worst thing for someone with ideas of reference. So, and paranoia. So, I stick to part-time remote work. That's what keeps me well. Now, what's the lesson from all of this? I think the lesson is we do need, I think, more of a centralized structure for people with lived experience to actually monetize their experiences. And I don't mean that in an exploitative way. I mean that in actually in an ethical way, because people with severe and enduring mental health problems have fewer opportunities for employment. And on top of that, they have insights and experience that has value. And now ethics committees and funding bodies are expecting researchers and public bodies to consult people from service user groups or people with lived experience when they're designing interventions or thinking about revising policy or something like that. So there's an increased interest in the sectors that have historically been quite closed off to lived experience, in lived experience input now. So there's this kind of U-turn happening. Suddenly we do want to listen to you. Suddenly we are interested in what you have to say. So now is the time. If you're looking into getting into this kind of work, now is a great time to do it. But you do have to do quite a bit of searching around for opportunities, and then in some cases there's an application process which you might not feel particularly up to if you have to write a position statement or fill in an application form or something. Not everybody's in the mood for that or able to do that. So that's been my experience for doing lived experience involvement work, and I enjoy it, but I wouldn't, take on too much. So hopefully that gives you some insight into what kind of work is available, different routes into that kind of work, and remuneration, payment. One of the things that I will say about this is, do not expect this to be a source of income. It is a source of money, but it's not income in the sense of like reliable, on time. You get paid when the institution's finance department decides that it's gonna get around to your invoice. Sometimes I get paid every 6 weeks. Sometimes I get paid every 4 weeks. Sometimes I get paid 3 months later. There's absolutely no way that you can budget and live on lived experience involvement remuneration. can't do it. It's not reliable enough, not in terms of amount, because they've recently standardized how much they're paying, and it's about £27 an hour, which is very good money. It's the timing. You've got no way of organizing your life around these payments because they're so irregular. So they're best treated as like fun money, savings, investments, whatever it is you want to do with it. But you're not going to be paying rent with this stuff because it just doesn't come in on time, right? So you are invoicing institutions, and they're not in any rush to pay invoices. So that's something to keep in mind. It's a bit like research participation. You might take part in a study and they say we'll give you a £10 Amazon voucher, and then 8 months later you get an email saying here's your Amazon voucher, and you think fuck off. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, that's my experience. Hopefully that helps.